Very good. Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our Mitchell Institute Forum for June. Right up front, what I would like to do is acknowledge our former Chief of Staff and current President of Business Executives for National Security, General Schwartz. General Schwartz, thanks very much for being here today. Now, judging from the size and the makeup of the audience, I really don't think I need to spend a lot of time introducing my good friend Randy Walden as our guest speaker today. But that said, Mr. Walden is the director of the Air Force Rapid Capabilities Office, and in that capacity he oversees some of the service's most sensitive aerospace projects. The Air Force is looking to the RCO to improve the speed it brings to bear on several important procurement initiatives, the most well-known today being the B-21. Mr. Walden was commissioned into the Air Force in 1982, and he served as a flight test engineer participating in the development and testing of numerous weapon systems. He retired from active duty in 2002 with over 20 years of military experience and now continues as an acquisition professional as part of the senior executive service. Prior to his current position, he was a Director for Information Dominance Programs in AQ and Director Air Force Test and Evaluation. So Waldo, thanks very much for being here today. You obviously have an audience that's very interested in what you have to say. So with that, the podium's yours.
Thank you, Dave, and I really do appreciate the invite. My first time to Mitchell Institute, so I've always wondered what this great think tank is doing for our Air Force, and it's always good to see some familiar faces in the audience, and appreciate the time. Public releasable, unclassified, so hopefully it won't come across too boring. So I was asked to kind of give a little bit of insight into how the RCO does acquisition. I'm going to give you a little bit of history. Next chart, please. A little bit of history. I'll get into some of the programs. I'll give you just a flavor of what we do and then touch on about 3 programs and what we're doing within the RCO. All right, next chart. So we stood up in about the 2003 time frame. There was a charter that was assembled based on Secretary Aldridge, Secretary Roach, and General Jumper. I'll give you kind of the setting. I got to play through that interaction from about 2000 to 2003. It was out of frustration of the requirements process and acquisition process. And so they wanted to take ownership of what was going on within the Air Force, certainly, but even in the greater DoD. There was terms out there used in about the 2000 time frame, DoD skunk works, things of that nature. So the concept of the RCO really goes back many, many years associated with other organizations and programs. So think the NRO in the early days. Think 117 Program Office. Think of those types of organizations. That was the concept that they drove towards. And you can see the charter we have up here. It's on the order of about maybe 10 pages. So that kind of drives our guidance. Signed out by the board members. The chair is AT&L. This was Dr. Carter. He was there in 2010 when he re-signed out and republished our charter. And then Secretary Donnelly, Mr. Van Buren from AQ, and General Schwartz all signed up to that document and provide our oversight and guidance at the time. And we haven't changed it since. I think there was just some minor mods to that particular update at the time. So for over about 13 years-ish, and most recently in the last 6 years, you're looking at the document that hadn't changed. So change is not always good when it comes to bureaucracy. So bottom line is challenge the traditional process, execute programs in a manner that does accept some risk in areas that make sense, and don't accept risk in areas that don't make sense. Short chain of command, you're looking at the board of directors. Now, trust me, I have multiple bosses, have multiple folks I need to talk to, but in general, I turn to the board as that guiding light and our direction. Next chart, please. So Secretary Roach actually stood the office up in April of 2003. Again, very short, one page, here's what I want you to go do. There's three main bullets up there. Basically expedite the development and the fielding of selected Air Force combat weapon systems. And the second one says, help others that need to leverage the Air Force in their activities, as well as potentially leverage their work in an Economy Act fashion that we get great benefit from. So that benefit could include, I'll say, funding savings, timelines, things of that nature. And then the last one is there's usually assessments that are required to, and AOA is the terminology used today, but in general an assessment that says, I've got a compelling story, we need to go look at a weapon system to go do this particular mission or a set of missions or in this domain, and that particular assessment kind of drives how we would go out and put together an ACT strategy to do that development and fielding activity, and again, approved by the Board of Directors. Next chart, please. Just a quick organizational construct. And Board of Directors is kind of our guiding light, but you can see we do interact with a number of folks out there, both on the air staff, on AT&L staff. We try to minimize the amount of bureaucracy. There's documents in place that drive how we do that interaction. You want to interact with the right folks in the air staff to be able to achieve, I'll say, the funding profile, the minimized bureaucracy to get through an acceptable plan and get it approved and move on with the fielding activities. The bottom bumper sticker there really talks about, again, short, narrow chain of command. You're looking at the 4 individuals that actually approve what we do for a living. And then small integrated program office. I'll touch on what that means in a little bit more detail. And then in each one of our programs, we do reach out to the MAGCOMs to get the warfighter influence in there. And think normal cockpit, working groups, things of that nature, and helping the SPO, or in this case the program office, actually deliver based on what their input is, not waiting until after you field it to find out there's some things you need to fix. The biggest piece that really plays out in the charter, and I'll say our overarching influence and interaction with the senior leadership, is the stable funding and requirements. B-21, from day one, the requirements have not changed. The Chief of Staff of the Air Force is that person that can make that change. So that last bullet down there really drives how one can do a good job in actually getting through development and fielding that capability. Next chart, please. How we're organized, again, top level, looks like a normal construct, although what's not up here is how small this program office is. And again, I term it as a program office, but it's really the whole directorate. We have about 150 people, if I even include some of the folks out at Wright Pat that help us execute the B-21 program. If you look below the line on the left-hand side, you're really looking at the products. So in this case, think of weapon systems, and you can see LRSB up there, B-21, and then a handful of other groups in there that do manage fairly large acquisition programs. And then, like most good program offices, you really need to have a good set of financial managers, contracting, and security to be able to execute the program. Those individuals, I would say, are some of the best within the Air Force, and we draw from those as best we can. They're not, I'll say, the functionals are not built out like normal functionals as from centers and things like that. It is a very streamlined approach. The term I've seen, these are gross numbers, you'd see anywhere from like, a half dozen to a dozen layers of bureaucracy in some of the centers just on the contracting side. In ours, it's 2. So you get a sense of how you would get through the contracting piece in a more streamlined fashion. And that's just one example of how we do a more streamlined approach on the functional side. The program managers, same thing. You've got to have some of the best out there that are willing to take on not only the basic program management, cost, schedule, performance, but in general, the systems engineering. You may not have the team of engineers that can oversee the primes. So those engineers are extremely value added to be able to do not only the oversight for that contract execution, but more important, literally be able to interact with the primes engineering team to be able to fix things. One example, we had one chief engineer in one of the programs. Can't go into a lot of detail, but I will tell you this. That individual caught a design that was going to be off by about 30 dB. Now, in terms of factorial, that's 1,000 times. That miss would have caused a major schedule and cost hiccup to the program. That's the level of insight and engineering level on the government side that's required when you have a program office that small. Next chart, please. So touched a little bit on the, I'll say, the charter, the board of directors and such. Let me get into a little of the culture. Everybody goes, well, what's the secret? Because there's been a lot of press out there regarding the Navy or the Army standing up their own version of an RCO. I've gotten lots of phone calls with regard to how one does that. We've given them all the paperwork. But I will tell you, it's really about the culture, and it really stems from not only the bottom of the organization, that culture, but all the way to the top. The board of directors is key. Bottom line is each one is in a category to help reduce unnecessary bureaucracy, get to a decision to move on, and getting through the development process and on to fielding as quickly as possible. There's a number of organizations within the Department of Defense, both in the Air Force and in, I'll say, OSD, that love to have meetings, get together, kind of talk about what's going on in the program, get lots of briefings from you, and try to help you. I will tell you, you want to minimize that and get on with the decision-making, the folks that really are in place to make those decisions. The funding support is critical. I mentioned on how the stable funding is key, both from the standpoint of in the service, I would say through the normal OSD process, think PBR, and then as important on the Hill. If the stability starts to get shaky in any one of those three areas, it drives, I'll say, schedule slips or certainly cost impacts to the overall system that you're trying to build. And in most cases, outside of just pure cost increases or schedule increases, the warfighter doesn't get it on time, and they're frustrated with getting that delay based on legacy equipment they have to operate today. Talked a little bit about tailored program management and reporting. We do have some deviations with FARs and DFARs, but these are not big things that say, that's the secret sauce. It is not that. Those are things that allow us to integrate quickly both within the DoD and within the Hill. Literally, we embrace the tailoring and streamlined words that show up in 5000. It's amazing. I got asked to help put together one of the pieces of Better Buying Power 3.0. One of the things that when I got in this group and started to share some thoughts, what I found was the first thing I wanted to do is rewrite 5000. I go, oh, wow, you don't want to do that. But I did get to meet the person that writes 5000. That was pretty impressive. But in general, what you don't want to do is write more down. I think we've got plenty of words in the documents, and I think it's really embracing the tailoring and streamlined words that show up in that document and throughout a number of, say, regulations and guidance memos out there on how to get this done. And then finally, and this is probably just as key, if you're always going to wait for that 100%, then you may experience a very long, drawn-out process of getting that last bit of a requirement met to be able to get it to some, pick whatever thing you like, IOC, FOC, RAA, in one of those milestone events. If you're focused on, yeah, I see the 100% requirement, but if I get 80% out there, that's huge in replacing some of the legacy equipment. And I will tell you that plays out nicely. Now, in a bureaucratic system, they think, well, we got 20% to go. So in that 20%, how much time, how much cost, how much requirements are going to have to be driven by that level? And again, that's where I think the decision makers at the highest level get a big vote on how much we ought to spend, how much time we ought to put forth to get that last 20%. And again, it doesn't have to be 80%. It could be higher than that. It could be lower than that. But the warfighter, those that actually are going to be spending the money, those making the decision on the funding, I believe have a big vote. So next chart, please. Talked about the senior Air Force and warfighter and other leadership directly involved. So in this particular case, it's not just the oversight, it's a very broad mission. And I'll touch on some of the programs. You see we're doing the B-21, so long-range strike bomber. We're also working the X-37. So you can kind of see an air and a space theme going. We do touch all the domains in what we're doing. It's not just one particular area. And again, that influence comes from the senior leadership and that board of directors on what they expect us to go do. Not me coming in saying, I think this is the best thing for the department. It's really their feedback and direction on how we execute. Again, the goal is to be responsive to the warfighter needs. I would say it's really more about the trust and focused oversight. We do try to protect not only sensitive technologies and things we would like to actually field to get ahead of the threat, but I think more important than that, also protect those sensitive relationships that we have codified to actually save taxpayer money, save Air Force, precious Air Force funds, and I'll say precious taxpayer funds. So in this case, if we do this properly, we can actually make the schedule more compressed. In most cases, without taking on additional risk, we can actually save a significant amount of funds depending on that compression. And in most cases, you can get a weapon system out to the field under a shortened timeline, a reduced cost, and I think you actually get better capability, mainly because you deliver it sooner than what you predicted. The streamlined processes, I touched on that briefly. Goal is to try to get out there sooner. I talked about the 80%. Try to get things off the shelf, again, hearkening back to other methodologies like the NRO, the 117 Program Office. You don't have to invent, say, a landing gear. Why don't you use one that's available? You don't have to invent some of the systems out there. Why don't you use that and integrate it together? And what you find is, again, you're not doing multiple, I'll say, ACAT-1 technology inventions on a single weapon system. So you have like a half dozen ACAT-1s. You really get it down to one, and it's really the integration factor that you're trying to do. And then we do leverage what I would say is off the SAP shelf. So there's a number of technologies out there that are readily available that one can't see from the public, but in general, you try to leverage that advanced technology that we've invested in and get that on a weapon system so we can take advantage from a warfighting capability. Next chart, please. A little bit more on the attributes. Again, this is key for a small, and I'll call program office. I talked a little bit about the engineers. I'll even talk about the program managers. Again, these are fairly junior folks, but at the same time, very experienced folks. And there's a lot that we count on and expect them to actually deliver. And in most cases, even though they think they're kind of getting out of their comfort zone, they actually come through. They do a great job. I've always kind of stated this. Most program managers don't come in to think how slow I can make the program go, or how expensive I can make it happen, or how the performance can be degraded. They come in going with, I'm going to make this the best weapons system I possibly can, save taxpayer money, and try to do it in a reduced timeline. That's the caliber of folks that typically show up, and we want those in our program office running the programs. It's only when you influence that program manager through other pieces, think of the bureaucracy, that begins to slow them down, frustrate them, et cetera. So we do want to get the best folks in the Air Force, and I've had the opportunity to see a number of those folks come through the RCO, and I would say go back into the Air Force and help some of the other centers out there. We do have significant activity, I'll say, in non-Air Force. Won't go into a lot of detail, but the bottom line is when you get that collaboration going and you're focused on a vision for a collaborative partnership, you typically see a handful of things. One, you're going to save money. Where they may be investing in an area of reducing some risk or doing development where you don't, where the Air Force may not, or vice versa, the taxpayer gets significant savings as opposed to doing it twice. And then on the fielding side, depending on how that goes, because there's always maybe a difference, the bottom line is you still get the leverage of the tooling and the manufacturing capabilities, albeit some of the changes may be there. You get that huge benefit. If done properly, you typically can save a ton of money. You can save a lot of schedule, and in most cases get a better capable system than what you envision just by doing it within your own government agency or service. Talk a little bit about the Air Force issues associated with rapid response. So again, I talked a little bit about the Air Force Red Team. Those that are not familiar with the Air Force Red Team, they were stood up back in the late 70s, early 80s in response to the second offset strategy to look for the Achilles heel for stealth. That's the same red team that's been around since then, has worked on a number of venues out there that I can go into a little bit of detail, counter PGM, things of that nature. The assessments and the studies that they do try to enable the work that I'd say the Air Force in general and the Department of Defense does. But from my perspective, we also leverage them in areas that we find systems engineering flaws that they might be able to help us with. And in most cases, they give us a set of, I'll say, acquisition set of derived requirements that help us get focused on what is important in that weapon system, either from a survivability point of view, a performance point of view, et cetera. In those particular assessments, not only do we leverage heavily, but I've seen the Department of Defense, Department of the Air Force take those types of results and actually implement them in a weapon system. Talked a little bit about the engineering reviews and assessments, again, internal, where you would see either a systems requirement review or a preliminary design review or a critical design review, those type of things, very large, everybody wants to show up. We don't do it that way. You'll see a much smaller venue, typically led by either the chief engineer of the weapon system or the technical director that works for me as the chief engineer for the entire organization. And in that construct, you're getting right to the things that matter in, say, a PDR or CDR, and getting on with the decision and moving on with business, as opposed to, and I'll use the term loosely, hand-wring a little bit about, hey, this is not quite what I expected, so let's not pass them and let's go back to getting that solved. And once we get that solved, then we'll come back and do some level of an intermediate PDR. Now, we're going to take on the risk, we're going to solve it, you guys need to solve this, here's your task, and then we close out and move on. Next chart, please. Last chart on attributes. This was from day one, the one thing that certainly the Air Force does, I think most services do it this way. You have kind of a program office, and then you have like the air staff, and on the acquisition side you have a number of capability directors or functional leads that have that go between the fielded activities, in this case the program offices, and on the air staff. In this particular case, under Secretary Roach and General Jumper, they wanted to kind of combine those, get the streamlining done. So typically what you see in my job is not only am I the PEO or the director of the office, but I also form and have a hat associated with what would be a mission area director. Think of the the SAF AQ3 letters out there, AQPs, the AQIs, et cetera. And then on the technical side, the technical director is really the chief engineer across the entire organization. Again, where you see benefit on one weapon system, you want to make sure and carry that over. And then finally, where you get typically the program managers, not always this case, but you typically have a dual-hatted system where they're also the PIM. And in some cases, like B-21, we have a separate PIM and a program manager. But in general, the goal here is to streamline, not have to go through, okay, I got to make a phone call to the program office, find out what's going on, get that back up to the air staff, et cetera. We try to streamline that. And one of the reasons for having the RCO, I believe, in the DC area, because a lot of things happen in this area on especially major programs. And we're seeing that today on the B-21. Program office functions, I already touched on that within the org chart. I got to tell you, you got to hire the right people for that across the board. The functionals and the engineers are critical, and the program managers have to be as top notch. And I got to tell you, we've been lucky enough to get a number of very, very well qualified functionals and engineers and program managers. Next. A little bit of background, more background on the responsibilities under the charter. It really just kind of talks about each of the roles, and at a top level really serves as that board of directors. So when we're bringing programs in, and I'll call it at a top level, think kind of a DAB review, we're bringing it in at a level that, that allows the senior leadership to see what we're doing, grade what we're doing, and actually put us on a vector that they want to see us on, as opposed to it goes through a much more functional bureaucratic process that you typically see in execution within in DoD. And so in this case, typically, not always, they provide day in and day out type of oversight and guidance. I don't know how many times, sir, that we used to come in and bother you, those 5 or 10-minute drive-bys, here's what's going on, we got an issue brewing, and we'd get that guidance. And we still do that today. We try to get, I would say, anywhere from 2 to 4 board meetings a year. And getting everybody's schedules of work is difficult, but in general, getting that group together, get a sense of what we're doing, and their personal involvement goes a long ways. I talked about the funding and the overarching objectives associated with meeting the Air Force's and I'll say even the greater DoD needs. The funding is key. The stability of that funding is key across the board. Those requirements are typically done. In fact, Secretary James and General Welsh, the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, basically signed out or codified how we're going to interact from a funding point of view within the Air Force. It looks very similar to what the normal process is, a little bit more streamlined. But again, the Chief and Secretary are the ones that actually approve the Air Force's budget. So again, back to the streamlining, you want to get to those decision makers for that final call. Let's see, I'm just kind of walking through the list. A little bit on MOAs and MOUs associated with our activities, both inside, think services, and outside, think other executive agencies. We ensure that AT&L knows what we're doing with those agencies and how we're actually going to save time and money to execute the programs we're on. I think that's about it. Next chart, please. So the acquisition planning, here's kind of the nuts and bolts of it all, really. So we really do start off with, you got to meet the statute, so you don't want to break the law. You follow the regs that make sense. You don't follow the regs or policies that don't make sense. That's what we end up taking to a board meeting, and they say, we like the plan you have. Now into really the nuts and bolts of the acquisition. So when we say tailored, we mean tailored. So the 3 documents we bring forward for, say, a acquisition approval or an ACT strategy starts with the tech development phase. So it's a concept plan. It's on the order, don't quote me on this, but on the order of about 1/10 of what is done typically today. And then if we get through that and move on to the next phase, we're looking at a development plan. So think EMD. And again, it's on the order of about 1/10 of what you typically see today, both in amount of pages, so document thickness, as well as, I'll say, the interaction with the folks to get through that process. And then finally, if you got through the risk reduction phase and you got through a good solid EMD, now you're looking to go into procurement or production. And that's the final phase we get into. And each one of those is separate and distinct, but very, very tailored. And I would say I've gotten good feedback from very senior folks going, hey, I can actually read this. It makes sense. So that's kind of the thought process, is make it very logical and make it very readable and understandable. So when we begin a program, again, there's lots of ways to get something going, but in general, it's up to myself and the office to come forward to the board and brief them. Either they ask us to do it or someone came in and said we want to do it. Then we ask, hey, we're going to put the story together and bring it to you. That's how we get the program approved up through the board process. And once the board says we're going to go, that's essentially the equivalent of a MDD, or material development decision. And then there's an ADM, very similar to some of the documents you'd see within the Department of Defense, acquisition decision memorandum, go out and do this program, whether it's in that concept phase, development phase, or procurement phase. Next, please. So a little bit on the programs. Start with the first real program we had was the National Capital Region Integrated Air Defenses. You're familiar with those in the local area. It was on or about 2001 when it started. I won't go into a lot of detail, but in general, we had to have it in place by, I want to say, the inauguration in 2005. And we started right in 2001. So it was, as joint as you can get. We had to work with the Army, the local folks here that were bringing weapon systems in. Our goal was to set up or enhance the situational awareness. That was our primary goal, get the right fusion engines in there. And we were doing that on behalf of essentially 1st Air Force, but think Northcom NORAD at the time. And here's, I'll share this insight. At the time, we hadn't done integrated air defenses, I think, in the U.S. since the SAGE system in the early 60s. And so who's the MAGCOM do you hand it off from an Air Force point of view? We couldn't find one. because of the way we set it up. So it was one of those things where I still remember this, 1st Air Force actually having NORTHCOM NORAD commander up, and we had a VTC with them and essentially field that capability on or about the early 2005 timeframe. And so that's just one example of something that was the nation needed. At the time, we were asked to go do it. We pulled together that story, got the board to approve it, and then delivered in a time frame that met the original goal on both cost and schedule. Another program out there you're familiar with, X-37, I won't go into a lot of detail, other than to say it's on its 4th mission. It's about halfway through. It's been on orbit about a year. It does quite well. It does give us insight into some of those space technologies that we want to buy down risk on. Family of systems, you've seen that out there. There's a number of family of systems. I won't go into detail, but suffice it to say the B-21 is a part of that family. There's a number of programs that make up that overarching capability. But it's not about one platform alone and unafraid to do everything. So the goal here is set up in a fashion that allows the right battle space awareness, the right ability to apply survivability techniques, think electronic attack, ESM, the right amount of capability applied across a family that gives us not only the access we want, the time and choosing we want, but the survivability that we also want and mission execution. So on the B-21, I'll wait because that one's coming up. And then finally, I'm going to touch on a couple of programs that we're doing. I think a little bit on the command and control, and I'll go into a little bit more detail there. And I'll touch on the work we've been doing in open architecture. Next chart, please. Okay, B-21, again, top level. A lot of this you've seen in the press already. SecDef directed in 2012 a number of things in a memo, of which was the $550 million APUC, and the RCU is going to go do it. And so we've been executing to that timeline since that memo came out from Secretary Gates. We did support both the QDR and the nuke posture reviews. Talked about a little bit on the budgeting, but 16 really covered a joint portfolio capabilities approach. There was a front-end assessment that was done prior to that decision, so it was vetted kind of like what I'll say is a normal program within the Department of Defense. We really did balance what I'll say is the capabilities and the required development, and I'll even say minimizing any invention, maximizing capabilities we've had today. And if you think about it, it's been about 3 decades since we've actually delivered the B-2. So one can imagine there's been a lot of work behind the scenes over those 3 decades to improve on that particular flying wing capability of yesteryear. And then finally, plan to procure 100 aircraft. That's what our goal is today. Get through, we've already finished tech development. That was on the order of about 3 to 4 years. We are already into milestone B, into full-blown EMD, and I'll say ramping up. Northrop Grumman has got the spin plan ready. They're hiring folks down at Melbourne. We are moving out on this program to succeed, getting through EMD, and then getting on to our first LRIP. And I think we show midterm for operational bases before 2030. I want to say on the order of 2025 is what we've been talking about as far as getting the first set of bombers off the production line. And then long-term normal basing, overseas basing, all the things that go along with that strategic plan and strategic basing. Overall, some numbers at the bottom. You know, one could say, well, how can the cost get so confusing? Here's an example. So I've got base year 2010. The 550 is shown up there as our requirement. If you look across and go down, the government independent cost estimate, latest one, shows that we're going to be ahead of that number based in the base year 2010. And then when you move out to 2016, when we snap the budget line at that particular year, you get a sense of what that APUC requirement, so the 550 really in future year dollars is 606. And then when you look down under the independent cost estimate that was done in 16, you get a sense of it's going to show about 564 million. So right now we believe, and of course it's on the 100 airplanes, we believe that we're going to be able to beat that 550. And so that's been really our theme to date, is to meet the 100 aircraft by minimum, move on with a cost savings, not only in EMD but also in procurement. The contract strategy out there was a cost plus for EMD. We want to get through that. When we incentivize that particular contract strategy, it's incentivized in the back end, not in the front end like normal. So if they don't deliver, they will not see anything coming out of EMD. And right now we have a fixed priced LRIP. That's already been released in the press. There's 5 lots going in. And like I said, that's a fixed price number today. And I believe we're going to be able to achieve a much lower cost than what we show up here. Next chart, please. A little bit on CMCC, Common Mission Control Center. Lots of people debate on what this really is. Is it an AOC? Is it DCGS? What are you doing? So what we found was, in some of the weapon systems we were doing, and I'd say across the spectrum in the Department of Defense and certainly in the Air Force, each system out there, and I'm thinking more unmanned, had its own stovepipe. And each stovepipe derived a set of services, think ground stations, and interaction with air operations centers and DGSs throughout the planet. And in most cases, they were creating their own version of those services. It was clear to us at the time we were doing exactly the same thing. We needed to kind of break the mold, because the one thing you typically see is services are the one thing that the primes are good at. They hire people to do that. Think weather apps, think mission planning apps, think all the other services in order to actually conduct military operations. So the goal here was come up with a set of standards with certainly industry's help. They're the ones that actually broke this down, was able to share the things that they're willing to share, but also holding true to what was really proprietary to them. And once that standard was put in place, we needed some mechanism, some way to demo or prototype that CMCC. And so we started with, I think, 3 primes at the time. I think we've grown to about 8 as a large consortium, and they get the chance to come in and play in this environment. Now, this particular system is actually located at Beale Air Force Base. We do a lot of what I'll say is the prototyping there, get a sense of how the right mission planning goes, because now remember, there's a number of folks that bring their mission planning algorithms. You can get a sense of which one works well, which one doesn't work well. And again, it's not supposed to be a competitive environment. It's supposed to be bringing in the best of breed of algorithms. And what you find is typically, not always, typically, just the sharing of information, because now it's got a standard, the sharing of information is actually more powerful than the one algorithm that you're looking at. And in my mind, that's the power of CMCC. And the vignettes that we typically do in here, think more along the lines of not just cutting an ATO. That's not what we do. What we typically do is try to be highly dynamic. In an environment where you have mobile integrated air defenses, mobile ballistic missiles, things of that nature, you've got to be more dynamic. And the goal of this is to bring in, I'll say, the best of breed on how one could apply algorithms, services in a ground environment, do that highly dynamic, I'll say, algorithm, share that information, whether it's imagery or ATO, supporting an ATO at an air operations center. That's the environment we're trying to do at Beale Air Force Base. We did a couple of different stages, crawl, walk, and run. We completed that over the last couple of years. They were both simulated environments where primes were able to bring their platforms in, simulate, but more important, we actually had live fly going. So think of Global Hawks, other platforms out there that we're feeding directly in and doing the management and actually sending information back up to them to say, hey, here's what we're seeing. Maybe you want to change your flight plan a little bit. That interaction was done real time. Again, the way we do it today, typically, not always, is we won't push a change to a mission plan or a route. Typically, it's either a radio or a new DEMPI or something like that. Next chart, please. Finally, our open architecture work, really kind of 3 broad phases, starting from the top, open systems. So in this case, we show essentially a radar. So everybody goes, well, you know, if you build a radar, you're not going to open that up. Well, it turns out you can actually break the pieces of the radar up enough to where if you do it properly, you can have the 2 radar houses compete each one. So it's really broken in the array, the receiver exciter, and the processor. And at any time, if there's DMS issues or you have a better system, the government now has an opportunity to compete that piece. The one that seems to be the long pole is the processor. At some point, if someone wants to introduce a new algorithm into that to go do some special mode, you got to go through and almost build a whole new radar. In this particular case, you might be able to just change out the processor, employ the same type of open architecture type of standards, and then implement what would be an ACAT 1 program in general down to something that is like an ACAT 3 and take a lot less time. That type of environment, what we're trying to do on the subsystems, a number of folks out there, and I'll say in the vendor community, is actually looking at how they can break some of those systems up. The next one down, open mission systems. You may have seen that in the press. The goal here is to basically allow the best systems to come to a weapon system, and it's more along the lines of a standard for an avionics bus. The goal here is literally to be able to come in with a new system, an updated system, think high-def full-motion video, which we see today, doing a change-out with minimal amount of regression testing, get it through the system and field it in a manner that's inside the timelines we want, not the timelines our enemies want. And in this particular case, if done properly, the numbers we're showing today run anywhere from about 40% to about 90%, both reduction in timelines and in cost. And this is not my words. These are IRAD programs through the primes out there and subs working together, demonstrating this. The U-2 was one. I think the B-2 was another. A B-52 was done. A handful of programs. So again, that's been out in the press. I'm just giving you some of the numbers we've seen based on that IRAD effort. And then finally, I touched on the bottom standard. That was CMCC. What we're finding here is there's a number of services out there that certainly can be broken down, and we don't have to pay 3, 10 times for a single weather app. We can get that to where we can get one app in there and then share it across a number of venues, specifically in the areas of those stovepipes I was talking about, whether it's a manned or unmanned system. So hopefully, next chart, hopefully, next, I think the summary is it. Hopefully I gave you some insight, one, into what the RCO typically has done in the past, what it takes for us to do streamlined, tailored acquisition, how we do our planning, who we report to, most important, how those programs come about, how we execute those programs, and then in most cases, the fielding of those activities, we get great feedback from the warfighter on. So, I know that took a little while to get through some of the acquisition backup, but I'll open up for questions. Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm Richard Whittle. I'm here for BreakingDefense.com. I was wondering, do you have sole source contracting authority, or do you have to compete contracts? And what's your relationship with the defense contractor community? Do you work hand in glove, or do you work at arm's length? What's the relationship? Yeah,
so we'll start with how one does contracting. In most environments, you would like to compete. You're going to get, I'll say, a better sense of cost benefit and perhaps schedule benefit. So you'd want to compete where you can. Can you do sole source? Absolutely, you can do sole source. But again, you got to have the right, I'll say, interaction, both with the industry partner you're going to partner with, and why they're the right person to pick in a sole source environment. Of which, again, even though sounds like we kind of do it on our own, no, I have a board I have to report through. Even in I'll say my day job, I, as the PEO, report up through the service acquisition executive to the defense acquisition executive. So statutorily, I still have to meet the requirements of whether you do a sole source or a competitive contract environment. Now, so working hand in hand with industry, absolutely, we have to work hand in hand. I gave you a couple of examples. One with that chief engineer that helped solve a 30 dB issue. That's about as tactical as you can get with a contractor, is solving an issue of that technical magnitude. The second part is touched on the services, the standards that we're talking about in the open architecture. Left unattended, they're going to go create their own consortium, come up with something that may benefit them. But in general, we had to get, again, very tactical with them on how those standards play out. And I would say that's probably one of the better examples, and probably one of the better things that will happen coming out of the office, is the open architecture work that's going on, both from the ground services that we talked about in CMCC, but OMS. I mean, the cost savings and time savings are tremendous. Hopefully that helped. Yeah. Jack?
Jack Hatton from Boeing. Can you talk about how you relate to 10CAP and Big Safari, two other kind of rapid acquisitions, fielded quickly?
Yep. So I know Big Safari real well. When I worked in SAF AQI, had lots of interactions with the programs that they were doing. So right now, I would say they're a program office. We're more of a program office. 10CAP, probably not as much, but they do program office-like things. I would say our interaction is certainly at a level of interchange. So if a good idea comes along and, say, 10CAP comes up with it, they start sharing, we listen, or vice versa. So it's certainly at an interchange, but each one will go do its own thing. So Big Safari's got a number of programs out there they're going to execute to. I don't need to get in their way. They've got their own way of doing business, their own, I'll call it equivalent charter, and how they do business, and their contracting.
So there's kind of an understanding on these things get bin to 10CAP, these things get bin to RCO, those things get bin to Safari.
That's right. And in some cases where the bin may not be correct, you could rebin it. And that has happened before. So, and again, and the board would be the one that says, hey, I don't like the bin here, let's move it over there. And those conversations take place quite often, you know, transitioning programs, things of that nature. Trey.
So, Waldo, you know, we were talking before. This so much reminds me of the Missile Defense Agency Charter 2002. The same exact authorities, the same exact verbiage almost in this. When I helped Denny Blair do a recharter of the NRO, same exact recommendations that we made there. You go back to the stealth development, as you mentioned. You go back to the NRO in the 70s, and the same exact authorities. So why can't we do this on a broader scale? And I mean, I think we all know there's a lot of rice bowls, there's a lot of oversight that would be broken in the standard mode.
Right.
But that's one question. The second question is, could you comment a little bit about your relationships with the Hill and how they appreciate how you do business, and I'm very interested in that.
Absolutely. So I'll say a little on the concept. Remember the concept, we're leveraging from 60 years ago on what others have done in a more streamlined fashion. So the methodology is the same, as you mentioned. I think MDA followed a similar methodology. A couple of things. Again, there's always there's forcing functions out there that may change the way the methodology or the organization reacts to different items. And one of them is bureaucracy. If something doesn't go quite right, more bureaucracy will come in and help. So you'll see that. And you got to be careful of how much bureaucracy comes in, because it will absolutely slow you down. And left unattended, you can end up with what we see today as kind of more of the norm. So along those lines, I think there are things you can definitely do. The first one is be mindful of the bureaucracy. The senior leadership, the board that we work for, has to be integral in that decision making and willing to say, we're not going to put up with this level of bureaucracy. We think we got it right. And if we don't, then you can bring more in. But don't make it carte blanche. And so the second big thing that I'm seeing, I'm not quite sure where the RCO is going on this, but organizations grow. And as they grow, they tend to want to do more bureaucratic things. And it's natural. It's, you know, this is something you need to do, because all these major programs are coming in. Lots of people want to get to the decision maker. So you have to set up processes in place. NRO is a good example of that. Very large organization today, but in the early days, it was really kind of a small program office. So I think you got to be mindful of the size of the organization. One thing that I always get criticized with is, don't you think you're growing too big? I said, well, we're kind of 150. I'm not sure what that knee in the curve looks like, but there's definitely a knee. So the question is, when do we get too big? And sometimes if you wait too long, you may not be able to catch yourself and you've grown too big. And I will tell you, there are discussions today about how I keep the organization right-sized in order to be as rapid as we say we are. And like I said, there's no formula, there's no model. Other people have models of how big programs are. We don't follow that model, so. Sir? Oh, yes, so the Hill. I would say we are as close to the professional staff on the Hill and all the 4 committees as I've ever seen. And even when I was in SAF AQ doing AQI with the C4ISR portfolio, as close as we were through staffer days and normal interaction, we are as close to the professional staff as I've ever seen, to a point where not only are we just doing our normal staffer days, but the interaction and the level of just getting tactically the job done has been very good. And I think that transparency, even at a classified session, goes a long way, a huge way. Sir?
Hi, Tony Capaccio with Bloomberg News. This is very insightful, I must say. Can you talk about why you cannot release the EMD contract? When do you think it's appropriate to release the contract value? And if Northrop starts breaching cost and schedule in the EMD and the overrun provisions are triggered, would you disclose that?
So I'll start with, I think, the first question you had, and that was, why don't we release the contract value that we put on contract with Northrop Grumman? One, I think it's too insightful for the adversaries to get a sense of what they can do, what the U.S. can do in building that next generation bomber. And by the way, that particular contract value you're talking about is not the true cost to the taxpayer. There's additional costs in there. So do we appreciate the offering Northrop had, and it was very competitive, and the numbers that are in there? Absolutely. And do we have a set of incentives on which we believe they should execute to, and they believe they can execute to? Yes, I do. But in general, releasing that, releasing other things that may be more insightful to our adversaries, I don't think helps the taxpayer. I don't think it helps certainly the warfighter, because all we're doing is putting them at risk, and we're showing our hand of what we believe this nation, in this case Northrop, can deliver this particular weapon system for. Now, sometime in the future, do we believe that's going to be available? Absolutely. But right now is probably not the time to do that.
May I push back a second? You're implying trust me on this. Did you get buy-in from the CIA, DIA, and other intelligence agencies on what you just said?
You mean as far as adversaries' insight?
If it's X billions of dollars, what did they learn from that they wouldn't learn from knowing what the unit cost is or the artist's conception?
Yeah. Well, again, we'll go into great detail, but the bottom line is you give them more information, you give them more detailed insight. In this particular case, we had an independent cost estimate done that was independent of the offering, and that's what we actually gave out. The $23.5 billion is what you've seen in the press. That is the cost based on an independent cost and meeting with SAR of 2009.
If Northrop reaches the cost of the contract, would you disclose that if they're in an overrun situation and the taxpayer has to basically bail them out?
Right. So Nunn-McCurdy drives us on those breaches. If there's a particular overrun that's happening and we breach a Nunn-McCurdy, any one of those, then we will be back both inside the department as well as on the Hill explaining why we breached. Okay. Bob?
So, Bob Ashton, SASC. So you won't give yourself credit, but your attributes, I think, are largely built on relationships. You built tremendous relationships over your career. How do you avoid that four-letter word that actually has 5 letters, JSIDS? How do you avoid entering into the muck and mire of the various functional capability boards that can definitely stop you in your tracks and delay things decades?
Right. So well, again, back to tailoring and streamline and the culture. We don't avoid JSIDS. We still have to have a requirement. We have to have a validated requirement. I mentioned for the B-21 a whole front-end assessment that drove us to that, the department to that decision. So again, we don't ignore that type of process. We streamline it. And there are ways to work with the Joint Staff through the Air Force requirements process. And again, from the board point of view, the Chief of Staff of the Air Force is our main proponent for the requirements. And so if there's something that's being brought up that makes sense, and the Chief says, we want to go do that, we're off and running. If it comes up through the process or it gets delayed, we're in seeing the Chief saying, you know, we're not getting the requirements in a timely process, and then he helps break that loose, and away we go. But in general, we follow a streamlined JSIDS process. We get a validated set of requirements. Sir?
Hi, James Drew from Aviation Week. So could you give us a sense, you said earlier that you leverage a lot of other people's money, and especially in the development process, trying to, when Boeing and Northrop were competing, how much, could you give us a sense of how much they spent of their own money to get this bomber matured? And also, because it's a family of systems, could you give us a sense of how much of the bomber is not included in the Northrop contract?
So you'll have to go to each company to get what they spent. We typically do not get that level of detail and insight. We get a sense of how much they're spending, but not certainly the amount. So you'd be better off going to Boeing and Northrop for that. Well, what's your definition of substantial? So you would have to talk to the companies on what they brought to bear to do the risk reduction. I would say in general, the companies, and I mentioned that, 3 decades past the B-2, the companies working with the government, and most notably in the Air Force side, have spent time and precious resources preparing our nation to put this kind of technology together. I talked a little bit of that SAP off-the-shelf leverage. That's one area that we greatly focused on in getting the B-21 ready for this EMD contract. What was the other one? There was...
How much is not included? How much is family of systems type?
Oh, in the B-21, or...
When you calculate total cost of the bomber, how much are we not seeing?
No. So on the numbers that have been published, the $23.5 billion for EMD, and the 100 aircraft APUC cost that you see out there. So do the math. The average math is $55 billion. That number is for the bomber. The family of systems is separate. And when I say family of systems, I'm not talking just my office. We're talking the vast majority of systems, to include some of the joint capabilities out there, not just the Air Force. But in general, this family is the one thing that allows us, and we fight wars that way, allows us to actually employ weapon systems of like a B-21 class to be more highly successful, and it doesn't have to do everything alone and unafraid. So hopefully that answered it. B-21 has its own cost. That's our job, to deliver the 100 airplanes, and will be a part of a much greater force for the future. Ma'am?
You mentioned the Air Force Red Teams and how they're used to help figure out, I guess, trade-offs sometimes. Has that been used for the B-21 program at this point? And if not, are there plans to? And if it has, can you talk a little bit broadly about what you learned from it?
So has the Air Force Red Team looked at the B-21 in general? Yes. Will they continue? Yes. In most cases where the threat may change or perceived to be changing, we'll ask the Red Team to step up and continue to look at the survivability attributes and how it would be able to conduct its mission in that highly contested environment. Sir?
I'm Pat Hose with Defense Daily. The Cmcc, when is that going to be fielded, and who are the primes that are working on that program?
The primes, so that's the top 3, Lockheed, Boeing, and Northrop today. Handful of what I'll say tier 2s or subs below that, so you'd have some BAE and folks like that out, the Raytheons and such. So that's, and I think it's a list of about 8 as a large consortium. Fielding, so right now, our primary goal is actually to get the development and demonstrations done of how one would piece together all those disparate algorithms in that standard environment. That's our goal, and it's predominantly in a location that allows us to get some operators in the loop so we can actually see how well it does, working both internal to itself, external to itself with other weapon systems out there, and tied in directly with DGS, so DGS-2 in this case. But in general, it would have operational leave behind if the warfighter chose to use it in such a fashion. But today it's predominantly trying to prototype and get it ready for what may become some future fielded program of record.
So do you want to field
I would like to see it fielded, yes. I think it's got great benefit. I think we're seeing a lot of really innovative work that each of those industry partners are bringing in a shared environment. And like I said, the one thing that seems to be very powerful is one algorithm alone is not sufficient. That's great. But the sharing of the data coming from that algorithm, someone else writing another algorithm to leverage the data that was just produced goes a long way, is even more powerful. Yes.
Okay, well,
Dave?
thanks very much,
Thank you.
Randy, for that tour de force.
Absolutely. Thank you. Anytime.
Don't run off. Clearly, you're doing the right things because you've got other services emulating what you're trying to do. And it appears that you're headed on the right track, so you probably have some time to do some reading. So we have a little token of our appreciation for being here today. That kind of encapsulates what you're doing is all about, entitled Air Power Reborn by Wing Commander Olson. So take this and...
Well, thank you very much.
Thanks very much for being here.
I've always wanted to know about air power.
Yeah.
Thanks, Dave.
Thank you all very much. Look forward to having you back again in July. I don't think we firmed up the exact date yet, but we'll get that information out to you as soon as we can. So thanks for being here today and have a great day.